Welcome to Talks with Summer, seeing the world through the eyes of another. Stories of love and loss. Today I have with me Tom Attig, a philosopher, author, and internationally respected voice in grief and bereavement. He is the author of The Heart of Grief, Death and the Search for Lasting Love and How We Grieve, Relearning the World, and has written extensively on grief and loss, care for the dying, suicide intervention, death education, ethics at the end of life, and applied philosophy. Tom taught philosophy at Bowling Green State University for nearly 25 years, where he served as department chair and led the creation of the world's first PhD program in applied philosophy, a past president of the Association of Death Education and Counseling, and a former vice chair of the International Work Group for Death, Dying, and Bereavement. He has spoken worldwide to clinicians, caregivers, educators, and the public. It is my honor to have you here, Tom. Welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you for that generous introduction. I'm a husband. I'm a father of 3. I'm a grandfather of 5. I'm a teacher. I'm a philosopher. And I'm an author, as you introduced me. I was born in Illinois, in the suburb of Chicago. I had mother and father working hard, supporting 2 children. My brother was Brother John, 9 years older. He was sort of in between being another kid and being a third parent. And I think he was more engaged with directing me and raising me and so on than my parents were, although my mother was a kind of a controlling person, so I had to break away from her just a little bit. Schools were good. I loved my teachers. I loved playing and being with my friends much more than sitting around reading books. My mother says, you're not doing anything. Why don't you read a book? I'd get on my bicycle. There were some days I rode my bike all day long trying to find someone to play with. I loved talking with people. I was born into 2 large families. My father was one of 10. My mother was one of 9. All of my mother's family lived in the Chicago area, so every major holiday featured crowds of, 30 to 40. There would be aunts and uncles in abundance, and there were 20 cousins on that side of the family, and most would show up for those celebrations. I loved hearing the adults talk with one another, and typically the women would go in one direction. They'd be in the kitchen, and I'd just go in there and listen for a while, and the men were in the living room, typically watching sports and not talking to one another very much, so I didn't hear as much male conversation as female conversation. One of the features that's significant for what we're going to be talking about today is that with these two large families, and my father's family being significantly older than my mother's, he was 18 years older than she was. All right.
Okay.
So his relatives started dying from various causes while I was growing up. And people didn't typically go long distances to attend funerals and so on unless they were very close. So letters would come about cousins so on, or uncle so on, or aunt so on, having died. And instead of my mother reading the letter and then giving it to Dad, and he would read it and so on, she read them out loud. So from the time I was very young, I heard stories about people dying, and not always in the most comfortable circumstances. I had a cousin who came to visit once, and his arm was partially missing because of a combine accident. And later in his life, he was combined to death. He fell into the machinery, and So I heard of horrible things as well as people dying of natural causes. And it just came to be part of my life. I thought everybody did that. Turns out hardly anybody did. When someone was ill and it looked like they might be in serious trouble, my mother took me to the rooms of people who were dying from the time I was 3 or 4 years old. It was just part of life. I didn't realize at the time how different that was. And I didn't develop an enthusiasm for dying or even thinking about it. But it was part of what made me receptive to working in that area once that opportunity came around.
Thank you. That is what I was going to ask you. So I'll move on to the next question. And you answered that a little bit. What motivated you to do what you do? Or in other words, how did you take this path in life you're on now? Moving on from there.
I've thought about that, and this is going to be a little bit of a longish story because it wasn't direct. I didn't sort of go off to school intending to get into the area of death and dying. I thought I was going to be a mathematician. I did very well on standardized testing for number crunching, and people wanted me to be entering engineering schools and the like. And it just didn't attract me. I thought it would be the thing to try, so I went off and told people I was going to be a math major. And in the first term, I was there in advanced classes because I'd been very good in high school at such things. I could not identify with the faculty members, for one, and I thought about, look, Tom, you want to be a teacher. I always wanted to be a teacher. I admired my teachers when I was younger. Some of the best people I ever met were my teachers in grade school and high school. And my brother became a teacher, and that was kind of a model for me. I imagined myself teaching trigonometry to people who did not want to learn trigonometry, using the same formulae and the same textbook year after year. And I thought, this is not interesting teaching. Yes. I think maybe the humanities. So my sophomore year, I took history, literature, and philosophy and said, what I like best and what I do reasonably well is what I'm going to major in. And I wound up in philosophy. And in particular, I studied existentialism and phenomenology, and I was taken by both of them. Existentialists seek wisdom about living a meaningful individual life with integrity. And phenomenologists study ways of describing and interpreting human experiences across a broad spectrum. I like that. I went off to graduate school in philosophy to study phenomenology with a leading thinker of the time who wrote a history of phenomenology. His name was Herbert Spiegelberg. Herbert always talked about, you fellows fight about whether phenomenology can really be done. I favor doing it and seeing what the results are like. So this disposed me to be an applied phenomenologist. My father died when I was in my second year of graduate school. He was 73. He was expected to live till he was 50 when he was born. He smoked 3 packs a day for about 30 years, unfiltered. He had various illnesses and so on, and he made it to 73. And I wondered about what those 73 years meant to him. And I wondered about what my 23 years with him meant to me. And attended the funeral. And I was driving back to graduate school, and I thought, this is just the kind of thing where a philosopher ought to be useful. As I was driving back, I thought of all the faculty who were waiting in St. Louis, and I could not think of one that I would be comfortable approaching about death and dying and just having a friendly talk about what deaths have occurred in their lives and how it affected them and and good ways of thinking about these things and so on. And I vowed to myself, I will be the kind of philosopher who's approachable. I didn't think I was going to go back and teach about death and dying. I got my first job at Bowling Green State University. They were developing courses on applied philosophy like medical ethics, philosophy of law, philosophy of business, environmental ethics, and so on. I taught ethics and phenomenology for a couple of years, and they invented a new college at the university, health and human services. So they had nursing programs, social work programs, gerontology, child and family care. And I thought, a course about death and dying, and in my ethics courses and so on, people want to talk about death and dying in various ways. A course in that would be good for such a college, and I think I can put together a course. So I did. It oversubscribed and continued to oversubscribe. And I wound up teaching my colleagues how to teach the course, and eventually I decided to teach large courses after I'd been teaching it for about 10 years. And in the process of teaching this course, remember, I had not at all entertained the idea that I was going to be a grief guy. I found myself asking my students to do various exercises in the class, and one of them asked them to talk about the three most important losses that they had experienced in their lives. I asked them to describe them and talk about what it was like contending with them and so on. And my students taught me that grief is not about going through 5 stages, and grief is not about coming down with symptoms. It's about being challenged by a major change in your life that requires you to change in response. And I began to develop this idea that grief is really something that requires you to relearn how to live in the world. Your daily life pattern is going to change if a major figure is now missing, and your life history is going to take a new course if this person who has died is a major player in living out the dramas of your life. So I tried out this idea that grieving is really a process of relearning how to live in the world, and my students said, yes, that's it. It's about coming to terms with the clothing left in the closet, walking around in the neighborhood where he or she was present and isn't present anymore, spending my time differently. It's about how do I talk to grandma now that her husband has died? Or how do I talk to my neighbor now that her child has died? How do I deal with my church or place of worship if I sense that I'm a kind of conspicuous and in an unusual state that they're not ready to deal with, and so on? How do I think about, well, I remember in one little book that I read, C.S. Lewis writes about his wife dying, and he wonders about, why should I shave? Who cares about whether I've got a shaved face or not? It's like that. And I was the first person who really started talking about that in detail, and it turns out that it's a pretty popular view, and I'm sticking with it. I keep learning more and more aspects of what it's like to struggle to relearn how to live in the world. So it's not what hits you, it's not what perhaps even overcomes you, or what happens to you when someone dies. That's the fullness of grief. The fullness of grief is taking that all in and then re-entering life. And as I said, reshaping your daily life pattern and redirecting your life story. And there are so many dimensions of that that I've spent my lifetime sort of expanding on that basic idea. Is that helpful?
Yes, and thank you so much for sharing. I wanted to mention that one of the reasons I was really looking forward to our interview was because I also lost my mother and my older brother consequently in the last 5 years. And I lost my mother just at the cusp, and the pandemic started, and we were all shut down inside the apartment where she had spent all the time. So I completely relate to it. And I was that person who could not really grieve, who was like, it felt really dark. I just could not take it out. I feel like it's almost going to be 6 years next year.
Hmm.
But when I talk to you and when I hear stuff, and I did a little bit of research when I agreed to have you as a guest, and I heard a couple of interviews, and they were still very helpful to me, and hearing you is still very helpful to me. And I feel like I open more towards the love and the pain of it. So thank you for sharing. And on another note, my background is also in philosophy. So it's so interesting for me to hear it. I did my master's in philosophy, and I do plan to pursue further studies in metaphysics, though.
The
So
world,
I'm
the
so
world,
fascinated.
the world looks at us as strange ducks,
Yes.
and some of your questions had to do with misunderstandings that the world visits on you and so on. And part of it is if you open your mouth and say you're a philosopher, there are stereotypes that are slapping you in the face and you don't really understand why. It's so easy to understand what a philosopher is. A philosopher is a person who made as his life's calling and career doing what everybody does in their daily lives. How do
Yes.
I understand this part of my life? How do I live it better? What kinds of things should I really watch out for that are bad things and are really hurtful? And children have these thoughts, and people who engage in teaching philosophy to children find very receptive eyes and ears. In part, the way I described myself to you and your listeners just a while ago, I was a little philosopher. I wanted to know why these women and these men who were my relatives were doing some of the things that they were doing and what they thought about what they were doing and what they were trying to accomplish. Philosophers do that. And I think everybody has in them this seeking wisdom so you can live better, motivation. And being a seeker of wisdom is quite different from being someone who pretends to have great wisdom. But we're all wanting it, but the world sort of pulls us into distractions so that it's kind of a pastime rather than a calling. And
Yes.
I'm called.
Me too.
Good.
So, what's the most common misconception people have about your work? And we just talked about that.
Well, I would say it was 60 years ago when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote On Death and Dying, and she talked about, and quite effectively persuaded a lot of people, that the dying experience difficulties in taking in the reality that they are actually dying. And they go through 5 stages, and there is ambiguity about whether you're dying or not. So even the doctors who know the best, as they look at symptoms in very sophisticated ways, say it's likely that this, but then again, it's possible that that, and some people
Mm.
this and other people that. And so there is this uncertainty that you can get a hold of, and you can deny that you're really going to be dying, and you can get angry about it if you really suspect that it's happening, and you can try to bargain your way into better treatment or something else. These are ego defenses. You're fighting or
Yes.
you're fleeing from what's happening to you. And when none of this really works very well, you can be depressed. Oh, crap. What I usually do to deal with things isn't
It's not
working
working.
for me. And then you get to what she calls the stage of acceptance, which is, I'm really dying. And some people have passed along the idea that it's not only dying people wondering about whether they're dying or not, but it's grieving people wondering about what exactly? Are they wondering about whether somebody's actually died when they have a body in a casket in front of them? I don't think there's much ambiguity when you have a body that has now become dead. And I don't think those 5 stages apply at all. And when I asked my students to talk about that, we hadn't talked about Kubler-Ross or any theories about grief. I just wanted them to tell me what their experiences were. And nobody mentioned a stage. Nobody mentioned thinking about stages of what they were going through. They mentioned something in the world that was now difficult to approach because this person had died. Or they mentioned the sorrows that they were feeling and the second thoughts that they were having about the relationship and so on. I think 60 years after she proposed those 5 stages, the average newspaper reporter in our culture and magazine writer and so on still thinks it's a settled discussion. Grief is about 5 stages. That is a huge mistake. And it leaves people with the message that you're going to be overcome by stuff that comes over you. You're going to be stuck in a passive position and so on. And all you can do is wait it out and hope that eventually the worst of it passes and so on. And my view is that experiences of loss leave you in a position where you're kind of paralyzed for a while because there's too much choice. There are too many things you can't figure out. What do I do next? But you have a sense that you can't continue doing what you have been doing because a major player in your daily life isn't here, and a major force in your carrying on into your future is missing. And if you're going to connect with that person, how are you going to do it in ways that you haven't been doing it before? That's the big mistake. If I could get into journalism schools and other places and teach people that 5 stages is the wrong way to look at this, I'd love to do it. But movies are premised on those 5 stages, and magazine articles assume that that's the way to think about it. And I think that a lot of textbooks feature those 5 stages. That takes care of grief. We've got our 2 pages in there now. We don't need to say anything more. And it's a much richer territory that is just not covered. It's a pain in the bottom. All right.
Yes. There's one more thing which I experienced during the early stages after losing my family members was that I felt that there was, people put a timeline on it. And that was also very bothersome and painful to me when someone said, okay, now it's exactly 2 years or 3 years. And if there's one more day you're feeling pain, then you go into some other category of help or something. So that was always very confusing.
Yeah, unfortunately, among my colleagues, and my colleague set is pretty broad. I know the leading counselors, I know the leading scientific researchers on a subject that is not appropriately approached scientifically, what they do. And in the last several years, they've created a concept of complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder. And it's in the DSM, which documents all kinds of disorders. And they say that if grief goes on beyond a certain period of time and so on, it's disordered and it should be treated. And in part, it should be treated by antidepressants and so on. This is terrible thinking. Every experience that we have is complicated, meaning multidimensional, multifaceted. Over time, it has a complicated history, and so on. Most human experiences are not as simple as.
Yes.
But when you say complicated in a kind of a medical sense, you're starting to talk to people about what's wrong with them, and that's an insult. For one, you're doing what's only human, And I think that the core of grieving for someone that you love is making a difficult transition from loving them while they're physically present to continuing to loving them or to love them when they're physically absent and permanently so. But the goal at the end of the rainbow in grieving is reaching that place where you wholeheartedly continue to love the person who's died, and you will not stop loving them until you die, and you will not stop missing them, so there will be sorrow until they die. 50, well, let's see, what is it now? Over 50 years ago, I still miss him, and I still love him, and that's perfectly normal. In fact, there are people who don't manage to get to that point. They don't manage to forgive the stuff that makes it harder for them to love them wholeheartedly, which is something that's a good thing to spend your time doing. We don't stop missing them, but they've given us legacies sort of beyond counting. And if you think about all that they've given you just physically to keep you alive, and then the encouragement and the instruction and life wisdom that they accumulated, that they shared, that's all yours. The motivations that they instilled in you are still in you, and it goes on and on. I ask my students when I was in class, when we started talking about this, I said, how many of you have finished learning how to live? No one raises their hands. Okay. Suppose grief involves relearning how to live. Do you think you'd ever finish with that? Probably not likely. It's just too complicated. I also ask them on other occasions, how many of you, when you came to class today, brought all of the people in your life who are alive with you physically? You could introduce me to your mother and father, your grandmother, your aunts and uncles, your best friends. They're all here in the room with you. Nobody raises their hands. I'd really like to meet them. I said, well, I'm sorry he's not here. Did you stop loving them when you came to class? Do you think they stopped loving you when you left to come to class? Nobody raises their hands. So you're sitting here right now, separated physically from the people that you love, and you're loving them, and they're loving you. How are they doing that? Well, I'm thinking about them. Some of them are thinking about me. I'm remembering nice things that they've done or said, or I'm connecting with, they really wanted me to be in school, and here I am. Or we're going to have a great party this weekend, and I can't wait to meet up with them again. Or, and I said, any way of loving a person that you can be involved in that does not require them to be in a room with you, you can continue doing after they've died. Oh, and they're kind of skeptical about that, but the more you think about it, that's how you love in separation, the way you've been doing it now. You've learned a lot about it. And you may learn some other ways of memorializing or deliberately remembering or deliberately conversing with others who love them too, or doing some things in their name, or putting up a monument if that's the kind of thing that's done, or setting a part of your home aside for a kind of a memorial where you can sit and remember and pray and cry and feel that missing without anybody saying, you're doing this too late, you've been doing this too long. Yeah. The world shouldn't be cruel that way.
I know, I know. I wanted to say thank you so much because I'd taken out down a quote from your writings, and it was the same one I just heard from you, so I don't need to read it out about separation. And I saw the little clip where you talked about how many people have you brought in with you, and it impacted me so much because I felt like those were my feelings. I could never give them words, but what you said just now has been helpful to me. I'm so sure people are going to get touched by this a lot.
I appreciate your saying that. And when you spend decades thinking about things, it just gets better and better. I mean, you think, you realize more, and people. The little kid I told you about is the one who listened to stories. There's nothing more valuable in life than sharing stories and learning from stories about living a life. And everybody's different, and they do things in their own ways and so on. But there are huge human family resemblances among the particular experiences that we have. I don't know, this comes out of, I just don't know what, but it's the world that we have to relearn, and we don't encounter the whole world at once. So I'll tell you a little story. There was a couple who wound up coming to my class and talking about how they, with others, formed a group of parents who had experienced the deaths of children. And their experience was that their 3-year-old daughter was playing on a swing in the backyard. Late in the week, she fell off the swing and hit her head, and they took her to the hospital to be examined. And by the end of the weekend, she was dead. And it turned out that she had an illness that was developing in her brain, but it was slowly developing, and the accident promoted rapid growth in this condition, and she died. I'll just tell you about a number of experiences that she had. I'll make it quick. She went to the funeral where they were preparing to bury their daughter, and on the way in, this is an insensitive man, the minister shook her hand and congratulated her.
Oh.
What? You have an angel in heaven. This is not a message that she wanted to hear. She was a diminutive little woman, and she said, if I'd had the gumption, I would have punched him right on the spot. I'm not thinking of that. I'm missing this young girl and so on, and you cannot know what you're telling me. So she was really ticked off. And she said there were people who didn't know what to say to her, so they said nothing. So they left her in silence, which was not helpful. Surprisingly, she was approached by her neighbor, who also had a 3-year-old daughter, and they had played together quite a bit. The girls had, and the grieving mother's daughter had come over and spent a lot of time playing with the other one. The woman called her up and said, look, we don't know each other very well. We've met a couple of times and so on, but you know that our daughters played together quite a bit. I'm really fond of your daughter and sorry that she's died. I have a lot of photographs of the kids playing together. How about you come over and we'll look at those photos together and have a cup of coffee? She said it was the most generous thing that anyone did, and it was so helpful. And one last story, the world to be relearned. The young girl had a little brother. When he was about 5 or 6, so several years later, she and her husband decided that they would take the little guy to see the sand dunes on Lake Michigan. They went to the sand dunes. They climbed the sand dunes, which is a typical thing to do, but it's kind of hard. And they got to the top of the sand dunes, and the mother started weeping. And the husband's solicitous, as husbands are, did you hurt yourself in some way? No, I'm just remembering we always wanted to bring Mary here. and now we're here and she's not. Oh, do you want to leave? This is a guy wanting to be a controlling fellow and so on. Let me take you away from here so you won't have to feel this sorrow. And she said, no, silly. Just hold me and let me cry. And when I've had my cry, we can decide what to do. Sensible woman. You know how it works. All right.
Yes.
So he eventually cries it out. And he says, well, should we go now? Still wanting to protect her or whatever. She says, no, actually, I feel like we're here as Mary's representatives. We talked to her about sand dunes. I know she wanted to come here. Now we can have the experience for her as we remember her, and so on. The point of that story is when you're relearning the world, there are parts of it you won't get to until it's surprising that you remember somebody there. Something in it reminds you of them. And the world is full of that for you for the rest of your life. If you can,
Yes.
if you can welcome those memories and reconnect and feel that love again between the two of you, the world's full of not only sad surprises, but there's something more than the sadness in recognizing that that would be a place that she would care about. Now you can care about it too. Things like that.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tom. This is going to be life-changing for me. I just wanted to reiterate that fact. So
Thank you.
moving on, because I try to get into the questions, but I'm so
Sure.
into listening. So I wanted to ask you a question. So incorporating a little bit of philosophy into this, I'm from the Indian culture, so we also believe in the afterlife, and I've talked to my sister about this a lot. We try to. So when death happens, there's also a tendency where we sometimes tell ourselves that we are going to meet them again in the future because we do believe in the soul. I do believe in the soul and the afterlife. And that's, in one light, that's a belief or mind knowing or something that's separate. But I often try to think about it from the space of grief, that is it a comfort which I have that I'm going to meet the person who's passed on again, or is it almost a denial that let me not feel the pain because I'm going to see them again at a certain time? And I often think about it. I don't have a full answer because my belief system and my knowing is always going to remain this, but I still am trying to find the clarity there. So I wanted to know your thoughts, because I'm sure you must have experienced people from a lot of cultures with a lot of belief systems which play into the grieving element a lot.
I think the kind of thing I've been talking about is a sure thing about meeting again as long as you are alive in this life that comes to an end for all of us. And I think there's plenty of consolation in that. I used to teach my classes, and I'm afraid I visited some skepticism upon my students when I note that in the history of writings in the West, and for all I know, but I'm not familiar with all the writings in the East, outside of religious contexts, and even in religious contexts. My daughter took a course. She studied psychology, religious studies, and eventually shamanism. So she's been on an interesting path for a long time. She took a course as an undergraduate on the history of hell. And the history of hell is a history of writings about hell. And there are very, very rich and detailed descriptions of states that are hellish. When you look at the literatures about heaven, there's hardly the same literature at all. When it comes to describing the kinds of experiences that you might have, you have sort of reunion experiences described and some aesthetic experiences having to do with shared experiences of beauty and music, and so on. And then it just kind of peters out. All right. And I asked my students to write a short story about hell and a short story about heaven. And they have the hardest time envisioning the details of going on through time for not only a few years, not only a few decades, not even a century, but multiple centuries, and the concept of everlastingness that seems to prevail in a lot of religious writing and so on. And it's really hard to envision what that would involve. I showed them a Doonesbury cartoon that was a favorite of mine on this topic. They're all gathered around around a bar or a restaurant, and they're having a conversation around eating and drinking. And one of them decides, when you think about heaven, what do you think about? What do you think that involves? Oh, it's a wonderful reunion, and there's laughing and singing and so on. Oh, like a big party then, one of them asks. I said, yeah. What do you suppose you do after the party? And somebody says, well, maybe we go bowling? That's that reflection of that difficulty in thinking of what it would involve. When I think as that kind of stiff philosopher that you know what it's like when you go into their classrooms, they're teaching you metaphysics, and they're teaching you cosmology and all this kind of stuff. For me, it is very difficult to think of having experiences like human beings have without a body. How do you see? How do you smell? How do you touch? How do you taste? How do you move? Well, we're in a different state that we don't understand when we're in this state. Okay, that makes sense. But what are you moving around in if you don't have bodies to move around in? And you get into these puzzles that are really hard to put together in a rational sort of way. My daughter's shamanism has taught me that with the help of special substances, one can envision things that it's impossible to imagine. And she's told me things about myself that she's learned when she has visited these sort of alternate states. And she has no business knowing those things, but she does. And I'm thinking, my skepticism is probably an immature sort of thing. There's probably more in this world to be understood than I can currently get my head around. So my view about is there an afterlife where we get to knowingly meet up with people and so on is, I really don't know. If it happens, that'd be wonderful. If it happens hellishly, that would be terrible. And I've taught and spent a lot of time thinking about whether being finite is an okay sort of thing. And we're limited in our size. We're limited in how long we last. We're limited in our vulnerability to suffering that's ineradicable. And we're limited in our abilities to understand. And I'm thinking this, if being small, if being impermanent, if being susceptible to suffering, and if being uncertain are not acceptable, then being a human being is not acceptable. And that's not a good place to live. So I think lots of psychologists' offices are filled with people trying to say, no, one of those things is unacceptable. One aspect of our finitude and vulnerability is unacceptable. That's a ticket for misery for the rest of your life. So I'm inclined to go with the idea that in all likelihood, we're finite beings, and our short lives, miraculous as they are, it's fantastic that we get to live and have the experiences we can have, including loving all the people we fall in love with. If that isn't good enough, whew, I mean, if you imagine a divine being creating a world and making it possible for billions of people to have the wonders of experience that we enjoy in our lives, some of which are filled with much more suffering than others, but there's stuff that's redemptively wonderful in all of the lives that we humans get to live. If that isn't good enough, I don't know how to conceive of a deity. So that's a long-winded answer, but
Yes.
I don't know if it's helpful or not.
It's helpful. So, what is something which is very close to your heart, or what is something you're passionate about?
I traced a little bit of my childhood history with you. I always wanted to be in conversations. We had a mother of one of the girls in my class who was like a mother to all the boys in her class. Not such a great mother for the girl, apparently. I've learned this later. But frequently there would be 6 or 7 of us in this woman's living room, and she was a teacher during the day, and we were able to talk to one another and puzzle about things together. And now and again she would pipe in and offer something, but she was like a natural teach the neighborhood how to grow up through your teen years, and so on. I was drawn to people like that. I could name several others, but I mean, she was a key figure, and you could just watch some of my colleagues, young guys, struggling with things as teenagers that I didn't struggle with very much, but they did, just being shaped and helped. And just, there's another thing about my life. I hesitate because it sounds like you're bragging when you talk about things like this. For some reason, people approached me like I was the local psychologist while we were going through teen years. And sometimes I had reasonably plausible suggestions about how people were going to be able to deal with some of the challenges that they were sweating their way through. So early on, I was kind of a neighborhood teacher or counselor on an elementary level, but I was seen that way. And for a while, when I was doing graduate studies and other things, I kind of forgot that was part of me. And I was a little bit more confused and so on. And I entered an early marriage that wasn't the happiest thing in the world. And I was beginning to see the unhappy edges of that. And I was puzzled and not very capable of finding my way through that. So I made it through 26 years instead. And then finally realized that if you're in a relationship and in 26 years you've only had friends come into your house twice, something's wrong with the relationship. So this is a bit of wisdom that came from a counselor. My mother was dying, and my marriage was falling apart, and it was hard. And I had learned that if you're having a hard time and you're not doing very well, it's a good idea to ask somebody for help. So I asked a psychology professor if he knew a good counselor in a nearby city, and he sent me to one, and that guy was fantastic. I wrote him detailed notes every week, and nobody had ever done that before. He said, "God, you're introspective." I said, "Well, yeah, that's my job." Anyway, I would talk to him and I would say, "Well, I know you should this, and I know you should that." And he says, "Why are you shoulding on yourself so much? Where do these expectations of yourself come from? You've been visited by people in your life, and they have taught you things or encouraged you to think in certain ways and so on. They're really not working for you. There's no sense in which you should this and should that, and you keep coming in here listing these things. Learn to let go of the shoulds. All right? Ask yourself where they're coming from. Do you really think that's the way you... Boy, those are hard. And I did a good job, and I became a much more effective, I think, speaker and counselor to the extent that is what I am. Just don't should on yourself. Have a good sense of why it is you're thinking you should do something as opposed to something else. And we get caught up in patterns that aren't very good patterns to live in.
Is there any advice you would give your younger self looking back at your life now?
Don't should on yourself.
The answer came before the question.
Also, lately, we have this wonderful friend in town who's had challenging experiences. She's a jazz musician, trained as clergy. She taught church choirs across Canada. She studied with Duke Ellington and Oscar Peterson to play the piano. Magnificent instrumentalist. And she studied and got a divinity degree. And she's quite the counselor. And she knows my wife and me well. And I was talking one day with her and I said, we've both been married twice. And, the first one was a mistake and second one's going so much better. She says, don't you ever call that first marriage a mistake. How old were you when you got married? I said, I was 21. As you look back at your 21-year-old self, how wise were you? 21-year-olds make mistakes or make decisions that they later regret, but they learn from the regret, and they grow that way. You learn from missteps, but mistake,
Yes.
no, these are lessons, and it's filled with lots of lessons for you. You've been blessed with that first marriage.
Yes.
That's a better way to think of it.
Yes. What do you feel the purpose of life is for you? Or in other words, what do you feel is your personal quest in life?
Catching the big fish. I think you could get that from everything I've said so far. I'm a teacher. I love teaching. The people I admired most when I was young was a teacher. You don't learn things for people that you teach. You bring them into spaces where they can learn for themselves, or you can describe for them experiences that they're likely to have, where if they're attentive, they'll pick up something that will be valuable for them for the rest of your life. The people I admire most and am most grateful to know in all of my living have been my teachers. Many of them are actually classroom teachers. Some are family members. Some are children. Some are friends. Some are public figures. Some are authors, and so on. If I can have an effect on people that enables them to experience more deeply, more richly, more enjoyably, more wisely, and so on, what a thrill. And they don't always sort of jump back at you and say, I want you to know you're the wisest man I ever met, and so on. No one's ever said that, or think, I don't know what I would do with it. But I've admired teachers. They've served me well. I'm a better person for having known them. If I can help people have better experiences or in some way live their lives more lovingly, understandingly, forgivingly, gratefully, I've done something worthwhile. And if you live long enough to do something worthwhile, that's the best you get. And I feel like I'm there.
If it were an ideal world, what does that look like in your eyes?
Where there are more people who consistently behave and think and understand that we're all in this together. Everyone is connected to everyone. Everything is connected to everything. I've got this image of how we come into the world. And we come into the world into the holding of lifelines from almost infinite sources, from the physical world, from the spiritual world, from the social world. Everything is connected to everything in a huge web of webs that contains it all. And we are not like atoms floating around in social space, and there are 15 or 20 floating here, and someone dies, and you are completely intact and unaffected. If you really are an atom, self-contained and self-adequate and so on, you're not affected at all when someone dies. That's just a bad way of thinking of things.
Yes.
If you're a web of connections in the world and connected to other webs, connected to others and so on, you are fed against by lifelines from all kinds of sources. And when someone dies, it's as if part of the web is no longer grounded in a physical existence of this person. But you're still connected to that person in lots of other ways that don't require physical presence. And in the web that you are, if part of the web, if you picture a web in a corner in a barn or something, hit by something, the whole web doesn't break up. A part of it does, and things are disconnected, but these are kind of direct connections, and these are connections among the connections and so on. Your mother dies, your relationship with your father is affected, your relationship with your children is affected, and so on. And grieving in part is putting the threads back together into a coherent whole of a daily life pattern that has meaning again. And it goes on like that. If we understood how intimately and decisively we're connected with one another, we would respect one another more. We would love one another more. We would be patient with one another more. We would avoid things that tear things apart, like anger or indifference or hatred and so on. A world that stays intact and doesn't rip itself apart with bad motivations and bad movements coming from some of these webs, deliberately tearing apart a relationship or harming a relationship that they're in, or working in ways that tear apart whole societies. I'd like people to be more patient, more loving, more humble, more forgiving, and ultimately the thing that I think is the best thing of all is grateful. If the world could be more grateful, people would live better with one another. And I'd like to think of myself as a gratitude promoter.
Is there any book, quote, or philosophy that has shaped your outlook on life?
Writers like Viktor Frankl and C.S. Lewis about grief, Mitch Albom, Tuesdays with Morrie, Ira Byock wrote a book called The Four Things That Matter Most, and so on. These books are filled with everyday wisdom that if people paid attention, they'd live better. I wrote a thing about gratitude. All right, it's called Being Grateful. Are you ready for this?
Yes.
Okay.
All ears.
Yeah, you breathe most deeply into life when you accept heartache as the price of love. You wouldn't hurt so much had you not been given a unique place in the great web of life, a life to live, soul and spirit with which to live it, and the privilege of loving and being loved by the one you grieve. The pain of missing him or her is an inevitable companion to the joy of his or her sharing life with you. Avoiding love, I'm not going to love again because it hurts too much. Avoiding love out of fear of sorrow would have cost you all that you miss. And allowing fear to control you as you enter the next chapters of life would cost you all you still have. When you realize your good fortune in having your loved one in your life, an amazing grace assures you that courage, hope, and joy outweigh fear, despair, and sorrow. You live more fully when you are grateful.
Thank you so much. That is so
That's
beautiful.
me.
But thank you for sharing. Each and every word you've talked about love and death and grieving I'm so sure that this is going to help all the listeners, and that's one of the reasons I'm doing it also. But first, it's helping me so much, and it's making me more and more open. And I feel I miss my mother a lot as I'm doing this.
Well, just remember all that she's given you and still giving.
Yes.
Would she want you to be doing a program like this?
Yes, she would
Well,
be. She
there you
would be
go.
absolutely delighted. Yes.
She's still with you.
Yes. Thank you. What is something that you would like the world to know about you, which you feel is often misunderstood?
I think that some people, when they hear that you're a philosopher and that you've made that a profession and so on, they think you're kind of arrogant, pretending to be wise as opposed to actually aspiring to find it and share it. So I think the stereotypes about philosophers sometimes fit. And that's why when I was driving back from my dad's funeral, there was some stiffness in that philosophy department. But I also think that I was unfair to a number of philosophers in that crowd, because I didn't know him well enough, and a student doesn't necessarily get to know his teachers personally very well. The man who was my dissertation advisor was one of the sweetest human beings I ever met, but I wouldn't have had that conversation with him at that age. I think 5 years later I probably would have. He couldn't see me. He had the worst eyes imaginable. He had lenses in his glasses that were that thick. And when I saw him read, and he read like this, when in later life, really later life, he had cataract surgery, and he could sit in a room, and you can see my books behind me, right?
Yes.
He could read the titles of the books from across the room. And I went to visit him. He said, "Oh, that's what you look like. I knew you were tall, but I didn't know your face." And I think I could have a conversation with him. And later in life, I also attended professional meetings where there was a man named Carl Wellman who had taught me graduate school level ethics and so on. And he turned out to be a wonderful man to meet at professional meetings and just get caught up. I gave a talk on grief as relearning the world in a series dedicated to Herbert Spiegelberg. It was a Spiegelberg lecture. And Carl was in the audience, and we went out to lunch in a group, and on the way to the lunch, he said, "That single talk that you gave taught me more about phenomenology than my years of engaging with Herbert," because Herbert was always in his head in very complex understandings of different authors' views on things and so on. And you just showed me what philosophers who do phenomenology can look at carefully. And I had a son who killed himself a number of years ago, and you've got me thinking about things I never thought about before. And I thought, yeah, these people are people I could have talked to. But I failed. But I think part of the failure was the stereotype of philosopher, and I bought into it too. I mean,
Yes.
we're all like you are, and like I am. You want to understand things better. There's
Yes.
nothing arrogant about that. All right. And we don't have so much vast understanding that it's too weighty and will make us fall over if we understand it. We're just doing simple things about clarity in living and decency in behaving. And that's what philosophers are about, who are worth their salt.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. So moving on to the last question, and I know you've shared so much. So if there's anything else about death and grief which you would like to share, and this question is, from your entire journey in life so far, what would you like to share with our listeners which you feel would be helpful to them?
This is going to sound self-serving. Your set of questions reinforced and reminded me of how the book on seeking wisdom in death's shadows is not only a collection of my best writings about death and dying, 14 things previously published in obscure places and 9 new essays, and so on. The book is a trip through my thinking and how it developed, but it's also a biography of me as the teacher philosopher that I've been talking about here. I've been flattered by what people have said about it. The endorsements and so on are just marvelous. But I'm getting old enough, so this could be the last thing that I write. It's probably surely the last book that I'm going to write. And this is really intended as heart-to-heart, catching your breath in grief. It's full of beautiful photographs and little passages like the one about gratitude. There are about 50 of them in here that can be read one a day and so on. It's really good for someone in the middle of grief. But you'll meet me and my life's journey in the book that's just coming out. And the incidents that I talked about and other things are in there. And coming to wisdom, I kind of summarize a whole bunch of things at the end of the book. And the little bit about gratitude is the one that I close with. If you want to meet me a bit more, you'll find it in the book.
And I will share all the links and all the information and the website below the video when I publish this episode.
Thanks for having me. This has been a privilege. I love it.
Thank you so much, Tom. This has been life-changing for me, and it was my honor. So thank you for being a life-changing guest.